The unseasonably cold October wind howled across the empty fields of Willow Creek, Montana, slicing through Jake Whitman's worn denim jacket. The town's golden days of flourishing farms and tight-knit communities seemed like distant memories. Jake, at 52, stood as a relic of those times, his face etched with lines of weariness and regret. The farm had been in his family for generations, but now it felt like a millstone dragging him down. This year's drought had turned the soil into a crusty wasteland, and the barn's peeling red paint seemed to mock him each time he passed. The engine of his old John Deere tractor sputtered to a stop, coughing out a final puff of black smoke. Jake climbed down, his boots crunching on the brittle ground. Ahead of him lay the overgrown patch of land he had avoided for years. It wasn't avoidance, really. It just hadn't seemed worth the effort. But now, with the bank breathing down his neck, selling this section to a local developer might be his only way out. Desperation had a way of making neglected corners important. As he hacked at the stubborn underbrush with a rusted machete, Jake noticed something strange. The ground felt softer beneath his feet, almost hollow. He leaned forward, squinting at what appeared to be a jagged crack in the earth. His pulse quickened, his breath visible in the crisp air as he crouched to investigate. The crack widened into a sinkhole roughly 6 feet across, its edges rimmed with loose dirt and roots jutting out like skeletal fingers. Peering into the void, Jake's chest tightened. The dark opening exhaled a cool, musty breath, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. He grabbed his flashlight from the tractor and shined it down. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. The light's beam revealed what looked like walls, smooth and carved, glinting faintly as though they were damp. Symbols were etched into the stone, their patterns both intricate and unnervingly chaotic. Jake couldn't place them, but something about their jagged lines and spirals unsettled him. The light caught on something further down, a glimmer of metal half buried in dirt. Jake's mind raced. Was it treasure? Or maybe artifacts from long before settlers arrived in these parts? He remembered vague stories his grandfather used to tell about the native tribes that once roamed this land and their sacred sites. The thought of sacred ground sent a shiver down his spine, but his financial desperation quickly muffled any reservations. He hesitated for a moment, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The cave seemed to breathe, the cool air pushing against his face in rhythmic intervals. It wasn't just curiosity that pulled at him. It was the gnawing hope that maybe, just maybe, this hole in the ground could be his salvation. He leaned over, gripping the edge of the sinkhole with calloused fingers. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the way his voice sounded swallowed by the darkness. Lowering himself cautiously into the opening, he planted his feet on the uneven stone floor. The air inside felt colder, thicker, and carried a silence so profound it pressed against his eardrums. As his flashlight illuminated the interior, he saw the symbols more clearly now, their grooves etched deep into the stone. The walls seemed almost alive, their contours shifting in the flickering light. He edged toward the metallic glint he'd seen earlier. Kneeling, he brushed away the dirt to reveal a small gold pendant, a crescent moon entwined with a spiral. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he held it up. It felt unnaturally warm despite the cave's chill. As he turned it over, a strange hum filled the air, so faint he almost convinced himself it wasn't real. Then, from deeper within the cave, something shifted. A sound like gravel crunching underfoot. Jake froze. The flashlight flickered, its weak beam now dancing erratically across the walls. He slowly turned his head toward the sound, heart pounding so loud he thought the whole cave could hear it. "Hello?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. There was no answer, only the silence and the sinking feeling that he wasn't alone. Jake's flashlight beam wavered as he tightened his grip on the pendant. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was alive, that it was watching him. The crunch of shifting gravel echoed again, distant but distinct. His breath came quicker now, fogging in the cold air as he whispered under his breath, "Get a grip, Jake." But it wasn't easy to shake the unease. He shoved the pendant into his pocket, his fingers lingering on its warm surface, before turning toward the direction of the sound. The flashlight flickered once more, and a chill wind seemed to rise from nowhere, brushing past his face. The whispers began then, faint and indistinct, like words spoken underwater. Jake froze, every muscle locking into place. For a moment, it felt like the walls were closing in, and he swore he could hear his name among the murmurs. He turned and scrambled back toward the mouth of the cave, nearly tripping over loose stones. Emerging into the cold October air felt like surfacing from a deep dive, his chest heaving as if the weight of the cave had been pressing down on him. The whispers stopped, but the unease lingered. Leaning against the edge of the sinkhole, Jake wiped his face with a trembling hand. The farm stretched out before him, its barren fields like scars on the landscape. He looked at the dilapidated barn in the distance, the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving livelihood. His thoughts turned to Mark. Jake's throat tightened as he remembered the boy's angry face the last time they spoke, his voice filled with bitterness. "You're so damn stubborn, Dad. We could sell the place and start over, but you'd rather drown in debt than admit this farm is dead." Mark had left that night, slamming the door behind him. 3 years later, Jake hadn't heard much from him, just the occasional perfunctory text message. Jake knew he was the one to blame, but his pride wouldn't let him say it. Instead, he poured himself into the farm, working the land day and night, trying to convince himself that his sacrifice was worth it, that maybe, somehow, it would all come back to life. And then there was Hannah. His wife had been the glue holding everything together. She had been his balance, his reason, his comfort in hard times. But when the cancer came, it swept her away like a sudden storm. Jake couldn't forgive himself for the way he had thrown himself into work, instead of spending her final months by her side. "I'm fine, Jake," she'd said more times than he could count. "You need to focus on the farm." And he had believed her. Believed her until it was too late. The weight of his failures pressed down on him as he stared into the sinkhole. But now, the cave offered something different, a possibility. If those symbols and carvings were worth anything, if that pendant had any real value, maybe he could finally pull himself out of this mess. Maybe he could save the farm and show Mark he wasn't the stubborn fool his son thought he was. Maybe he could make things right. Still, the unease clung to him. He glanced back at the dark opening. The whispers had felt real, tangible, like a warning meant only for him. But desperation has a way of drowning out fear, and Jake had run out of options. The wind picked up, and with it came the faintest hint of a voice, so quiet it could have been the rustling of leaves. It sent shivers crawling up his spine. Ignoring it, he reached for his phone and dialed the only person in Willow Creek he could think of who might know what the carvings meant. "Claire Reynolds," he said when the call connected, his voice hoarse. "I've got something you need to see." As the words left his lips, the pendant in his pocket seemed to hum faintly, a warmth seeping through the fabric. Jake didn't know it yet, but the cave, and whatever lay within, was not finished with him. Not by a long shot. Jake sat across from Claire Reynolds in the dusty archives room of the Willow Creek Historical Society. The smell of aged paper and wood polish hung in the air as Claire examined the gold pendant he'd brought her. A middle-aged historian with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, she handled the artifact with reverence, her gloved hands tracing its intricate carvings. "This is remarkable," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe. "These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're tsalagi." She glanced up at Jake, her expression a mixture of excitement and caution. "You might know them better as the Cherokee. This design, particularly the spiral and crescent, suggests it was meant for ceremonial use. It could be hundreds of years old." Jake leaned back in his chair, trying to digest her words. He'd heard of the Tsalagi tribe in passing, but had never considered their connection to his land. "Ceremonial use," he repeated, his rough voice edged with skepticism. "So it's valuable?" Claire frowned, setting the pendant down carefully. "Jake, this isn't just about money. If this pendant came from a sacred site, disturbing it could be problematic. Many tribes believe these places are gateways between worlds, places of power and protection. You said you found this in a cave." Jake nodded, but his gaze flicked away. He didn't want to admit how strange the cave had felt. The whispers, the cold that seemed alive. "Yeah, in a sinkhole on my property. There's more down there. Carvings, walls, stuff that doesn't look natural." Claire's eyes widened. Jake, listen to me. If this cave is sacred ground, you can't just take things from it. That kind of desecration doesn't end well, for anyone. Her warning stirred something in him, a faint echo of the unease he'd felt in the cave. But desperation was a stubborn thing. Jake shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. I'm just looking to survive, Claire. The bank's breathing down my neck. If there's something valuable down there, I don't have the luxury to ignore it. She sighed, clearly frustrated but resigned. At least let me document what you found. This isn't just about you, Jake. It's history. He nodded but made no promises. As he left the Historical Society, the pendant's weight in his pocket felt heavier than before, as if Claire's words had imbued it with a new significance. That night, the whispers came back. Lying in bed, Jake stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Faint murmurs drifted through the stillness of the house, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. They weren't words he could understand, but they felt directed at him, accusatory, beckoning. The next morning, despite Claire's warning, he found himself standing at the sinkhole again. The pull was irresistible now, a need to know what lay deeper in the cave. He climbed down with a rope and his flashlight, determined to press on. The air inside was colder than he remembered, the walls slick with moisture. The carvings seemed to glow faintly, their patterns twisting in ways that made his head ache if he stared too long. The pendant in his pocket grew warmer as he ventured further, almost as if guiding him. Then the ground gave way. The fall was brief but bone-jarring, and Jake landed in a heap on a lower cavern floor. His flashlight had clattered out of his hand, its beam casting erratic shadows on the walls. For a moment, he lay still, gasping, his body trembling with adrenaline. When he finally managed to sit up, the light revealed what he had fallen into. Bones, countless bones, scattered across the cavern floor, some arranged in deliberate patterns around a stone altar at the center. The altar was carved with symbols similar to those on the pendant, but far more intricate, their lines seeming to pulse faintly as though alive. A chill ran through him. These weren't just animal remains. Human skulls stared at him from the shadows, their empty sockets accusatory. On the altar itself lay an engraved tablet, its surface cracked but legible. He moved closer, his heart pounding, and read the inscription. "The unworthy will pay the price of greed." The words sent a bolt of fear through him, his breath hitching. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over a femur, and the pendant in his pocket seemed to hum, its warmth turning almost searing. "Jake." The voice was unmistakable this time, his name spoken with a clarity that cut through the oppressive silence. He whipped around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly, but there was no one there, only the shadows, shifting and coiling as if alive. The air grew colder, pressing against him like an unseen force. The whispers rose again, louder now, overlapping and urgent, filling the cavern with a cacophony of sound. Jake clutched the pendant through his pocket, the metal burning against his palm, and bolted for the rope he had used to climb down. He scaled the wall with a desperation he hadn't felt since his wife's final days, the voices chasing him all the way to the surface. When he finally crawled out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, the farm seemed different. The sky was darker than it should have been for mid-afternoon, the sun obscured by thick, swirling clouds. The fields felt lifeless, the silence oppressive. And then he saw it, his livestock pen, empty. Not a single cow or chicken remained, their absence as eerie as the cavern he had fled. That evening, as Jake tried to process what had happened, the power in the house flickered and died. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now, as if they had grown in his absence. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling, and dialed Mark's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Jake hesitated, then left a message, his voice raw with emotion. "Mark, it's your dad. I need to talk to you. There's something happening here. Something I can't explain. I need your help." He hung up and sat in the dark, the pendant still heavy in his pocket, and the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried the faintest whisper of his name. Jake stood at the edge of the sinkhole once again, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. The farm lay silent behind him, cloaked in an unnatural stillness. The livestock hadn't returned, and the house felt colder each night, as though the shadows inside were gathering strength. He'd spent the previous day pacing, replaying Claire's warnings and the whispers in the cave, but the weight in his chest wouldn't lift. The answers lay below, and he couldn't ignore the pull any longer. This time, he descended with purpose, his boots scraping against the craggy walls as he climbed into the darkness. The pendant, now a permanent fixture in his pocket, felt alive against his thigh, growing warmer with each step. As he reached the cavern floor, the air thickened, pressing against his lungs. The whispers began again, louder now, their words clearer yet still maddeningly out of reach. He moved toward the altar, his steps hesitant but deliberate. Beyond the skeletal remains, beyond the inscriptions, his flashlight beam caught something new, a massive stone door carved directly into the cavern wall. It was adorned with intricate Tsalagi symbols, spirals and crescents interwoven with jagged lines. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible frequency. Jake approached slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the pendant. It pulsed against his palm, urging him forward. The whispers crescendoed, a cacophony of voices overlapping until they formed a single word: unworthy. He froze, his breath hitching. But he couldn't turn back now. With trembling fingers, he touched the surface of the stone door. The world shifted. In an instant, he was no longer in the cave. He stood in a vast field, golden under the sunlight, surrounded by a group of Tsalagi people. Their faces were solemn, their eyes filled with pain. A wave of understanding washed over Jake as he watched settlers march onto the land, rifles slung over their shoulders and greed in their eyes. The settlers spoke words of peace, but carried violence in their hearts. The Tsalagi's sacred ground was torn apart, their artifacts looted, their people displaced or worse. The vision shifted again, this time to Jake's own life. He saw himself in the hospital room with Hannah, sitting beside her bed but distracted by a spreadsheet of farm expenses. He saw Mark, a teenager then, begging him to come to his school play, but Jake waving him off with a gruff, "I'm busy." He saw his son storming out of the house after their last fight, his words echoing in the air like a curse. "You care more about this farm than your own family." The images overwhelmed him, blending into a swirl of pain and regret. The whispers grew louder, accusing him of selfishness, greed, failure. Tears streamed down Jake's face as he dropped to his knees before the stone door. He pressed his palms against the cold surface, his body trembling with grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything." The whispers paused, the cavern falling into a sudden, eerie silence. Then the ground beneath him began to rumble. The door cracked, a jagged line splitting its surface as the cave groaned and trembled. Stones fell from the ceiling, and dust choked the air. Jake staggered back, coughing, as the altar and the skeletal remains seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. He turned toward the rope he had climbed down, but the pendant in his pocket seared against his skin, forcing him to stop. The relics. If he took them, he could save the farm. Claire's warnings, the visions, the whispers, they all seemed to fade as the desperation to survive clawed its way to the forefront of his mind. The walls cracked further, the ground beneath him threatening to give way. The relics could solve everything. He could make things right with Mark. He could rebuild. But the vision of the Tsalagi people lingered in his mind. Their pain, their betrayal. And the words on the tablet, "The unworthy will pay the price of greed." With a guttural cry, Jake reached into his pocket and yanked the pendant out, staring at its glowing surface. It seemed to pulse, waiting for his decision. "No," he said aloud, his voice firm. "This isn't mine to take." He hurled the pendant onto the altar. The glow intensified, blinding him, and the rumbling grew deafening. Jake ran for the rope, climbing with a speed born of pure adrenaline as the cavern collapsed around him. Stones rained down, the ground buckling, the whispers rising one last time in a mournful wail. He reached the surface, just as the sinkhole caved in entirely, leaving a jagged scar in the earth where the cave had been. Jake fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The farm was still silent, but the air felt lighter somehow, as though the oppressive weight had lifted. He looked out at the barren fields and broken fences and felt something he hadn't in years, a glimmer of peace. The farm might not survive, but maybe, just maybe, he could. As he sat there, covered in dirt and sweat, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Mark. "Got your message. I'm coming home. Let's talk." Jake's throat tightened, his vision blurring with tears. The cave was gone, the relics buried, but perhaps the real treasure had been something else all along. For the first time in years, he felt hope. The next morning dawned with an unseasonable warmth, the sun breaking through a veil of soft clouds to cast golden light across the farm. Jake stood by the kitchen window, cradling a cup of coffee in his hands. His body ached from the ordeal, but his mind felt strangely calm. The sinkhole was gone, filled with rubble and dirt, as though the cave had never existed. Yet the memory of the altar, the carvings and the whispers lingered in his chest, sharp and undeniable. The farm was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wind against the house. Jake's eyes drifted across the barren fields, catching on the empty livestock pen and the broken fence posts. It should have looked hopeless, but for the first time in years, it didn't. The land was scarred but still standing, just like him. A rumble of tires on the gravel driveway broke the silence. Jake turned, his heart skipping a beat as an old grey truck pulled to a stop. The door creaked open, and Mark stepped out, his face hesitant but resolute. He hadn't been home in years, and yet here he was, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a bag slung over his shoulder. Jake walked out onto the porch, his boots thudding against the wood. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared history filling the space between them. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "I got your message," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "Figured it was time to stop running." Jake nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm glad you're here." His voice cracked, raw with emotion. I wasn't sure you'd come." Mark set down the toolbox and crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the farm. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted, then met his father's gaze. "But I think we've both been carrying too much alone." Jake felt the words settle deep within him, a truth he hadn't been able to say aloud. "I was wrong, Mark," he said softly. "About the farm. About a lot of things. I should have listened to you. To Mom. I thought holding on to this place was the only way to honor her, but maybe honoring her means something different now." Mark's expression softened, and for the first time in years, Jake saw the boy he used to know, the one who had always looked up to him before disappointment set in. "We don't have to figure it all out today," Mark said. "Let's start with fixing the fence." Jake smiled, the tightness in his chest loosening. "Sounds like a plan." They spent the day working side by side, hammering in new posts and stringing fresh wire. The physical labor felt cathartic, each strike of the hammer a step toward rebuilding, not just the farm but their relationship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in a fiery glow, Jake and Mark stood near the sinkhole's edge. They had carried a small wooden marker from the barn, carved with simple words, "In memory of those who came before." Jake drove the marker into the earth, his hands steady. Mark stood beside him, pressing the wood deeper until it was firm. For a moment, they simply stood there, the air around them still and reverent. "This land has its history," Jake said quietly, "and it's ours now, to honor, not to own." Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the marker. "We'll make it right, Dad, together." As they walked back to the house, the farm seemed different. The shadows didn't feel as heavy, and the wind carried the faintest promise of renewal. Jake glanced at his son, feeling something he hadn't in years. Hope. Maybe the farm wasn't just a burden or a legacy. Maybe, like the land itself, it could grow again.